clicker to, so you have to go back and forth. Yeah. I'm going to test it. Okay. Okay, it works.
Good morning. My name is Hannah Pryor. Today I'll be presenting my research project from this semester. I entitled it Whore's Glory, Prostitution and Opportunity in Gold Rush San Francisco. My thesis was, with the exception of Chinese sex slaves and white madams, prostitutes in Gold Rush San Francisco generally experienced the same freedoms and opportunities as women in different industries. And to provide a bit of background on my subject, I have defined for you my personal definition that I use for this analysis of both freedom and opportunity. Freedom is the presence of self-determination and independence in one's life. In my analysis, I measured this by the level of free will experienced within each institution. And for opportunity, I define this as the chance for advancement or progression. This was measured by the possibility for economic and social advancements within the San Francisco hierarchy, as well as within the specific industries that the women worked in. Next, I'll be providing some background on the time period, as well as what women experienced during this time. The San Francisco Gold Rush began in 1848 with the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill and continued until 1855. However, my analysis continues up until the end of the century. The discovery of gold led to a large population growth due to people emigrating from around the world as well as within the United States. These people were people seeking their fortune either by looking for gold or to set up business for these miners who were coming seeking gold. There was also a high success of female industries. These are due to the same reasons, which were low female population. The ratio of men to women in 1849 was 50-1, which meant that women were in high demand and they could capitalize on this desire for feminine company, whether that was by selling sexual services or by opening their own businesses. Another reason why women experienced such success by opening their own businesses was through gender roles. They would often perform traditionally feminine duties, such as housework for these miners, in exchange for money. Furthermore, the population this time was mostly migratory single men, and the transient male population allowed for an outgrowth of strong female industries based in these gender roles. For example, the miners needed places to stay, so the accommodations industry sprung up. They also needed help with their laundry, cooking, and cleaning, duties that they wouldn't necessarily want to do themselves, either because of their belief in traditional gender roles or simply because they didn't do it as well as women who had the training in these areas. The temporary nature of early San Francisco also allowed for certain vices to become more acceptable. They didn't feel like there would be any real consequences for their actions, so areas such as prostitution, opium usage, and gambling became more acceptable, which allowed for the success of these industries as well. What this means is that female industries became prominent for the same reasons, which allowed for similar levels of freedom and opportunity to be present across the board. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule. I believe that these exceptions are the reasons why certain historians would argue that prostitution was either an exploitive industry or one of the best to be in that allowed the most freedom and opportunity. For example, the madams of San Francisco experienced the most freedom and opportunity out of all the San Francisco women. These women owned and ran parlor houses. They were essentially the managers. This means that they would take care of bookkeeping. They would run the house of between 10 and 20 girls, and they were also responsible for attracting customers by orchestrating soirees where the wealthy men or their clients would meet the newer girls within the parlor house. And they would also coordinate with food and wine merchants, as well as dressmakers and hat makers to make sure that everything in the parlor house was running smoothly. These women also didn't prostitute themselves in order to maintain the necessary image of their parlor house. These women received extremely high wages. Over 1,000 madams reported financial assets totaling $3,000, which in today's money is about $80,000. This coordinates with the high level of respectability they received from the people in San Francisco. This is due to the esteem and properness, or at least the perceived esteem and properness of their institutions, and correlates with the high status that these women experience. Overall, madams experience the most freedom and opportunity of all women in San Francisco. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Chinese sex slaves. These women experience the least freedom and opportunity of all San Francisco women. Chinese women were imported beginning in 1853. By 1860, 583 out of the 681 Chinese women present in San Francisco were prostitutes. After being auctioned off to the highest bidder, these women would work as concubines and harems for wealthy Chinese men, meaning that they would have personal prostitution houses that they kept only for themselves, or Chinese women would work in cribs, which were low-level, dingy institutions. These were specifically for white men only. They experienced a very high labor intensity due to the fact that they were expected to work at all hours, and they also received no wages for their work. Furthermore, they experienced no level of free will because they were sold by their families into prostitution, indentured for their passage from China, or they were kidnapped by headhunters for these specific brothels. They were also treated extremely poorly and punished for any infraction to the rules or for trying to escape, as well as kept in small rooms at all hours, only let out once every few weeks for a quick walkabout, and they were also physically abused. Needless to say, this job destroyed the Chinese prostitutes both mentally and physically, and they became a highly diseased population, and they virtually became unsellable within 6 years of their contract. And then at this point, they were left to die in the back alleys of Chinatown. So this goes without saying, but they received no respect from the people in San Francisco. They also had the lowest social status, and they also had no free will or opportunity to move up within the San Francisco hierarchy or within the institution of prostitution itself. On the other hand, besides these two exceptions of women within prostitution, I would argue that prostitutes experience the same level of freedom and opportunity as women in other industries. For example, many prostitutes worked in gambling, dance, and concert halls. This allotted them a mid-range level of freedom and opportunity. The job was essentially the same across the board. They were to entertain the men that entered the establishments. So in gambling halls, this would mean spinning the roulette wheel, dealing cards, or just accompanying the men at the gambling tables. And in dance halls, they would dance on stage as well as within, So there were also pretty waiter girls who were in charge of serving food and drink. They received pretty moderate wages, about $15 to $25 a week, and they received 50% of the commission on any prostitution they did within the hours of their employment, or 100% of which that they did outside of their employment. They also had a possibility for social and economic advancement because they could be discovered by a madam or a wealthy man who could move her into a parlor house. There were also women that worked in parlor houses and brothels. They experienced a higher end of freedom and opportunity, higher wages, a higher degree of respectability due to the extravagance of parlor houses. And brothels were second rate, so they were just a step behind these women. So there was a higher amount of social mobility. In the accommodations industry, and as well as domestic service and education, as prostitutes. In the accommodations industry, there was a high demand for domestic labor, which meant that they could make a lot of money off of it. However, they could not expect to become rich in this field. This would include cooking, cleaning, keeping house, laundry, sewing, and it was extremely difficult labor. Required a lot of physical effort at this time due to the lack of modern amenities. And they had a difficulty raising up within the hierarchy of San Francisco due to the fact that they could not raise up within this industry and were expected to stay static. Another industry women were employed in was domestic service. These women were maids and housekeepers in wealthy homes in the 1850s and 60s, once private residences became more prominent. They earned about $50 to $75 a month, and there was a low competition for these positions because they were reserved for Chinese men or single women, due to the fact that they were expected to live with the family that they worked for. It was an extremely dependable option. 42% of employed women in 1870 worked in domestic service. And once again, this was extremely intensive labor. So they lacked the ability to move up within social and economic hierarchies, and therefore received a mid-level freedom and opportunity range. The last institution I'll be speaking of is education. As more families moved out to San Francisco and people started to settle down, there were more kids, which meant that there would be more schools and more jobs for women as teachers. And at this time, these positions were reserved exclusively for women up until 1860. The wages were relatively high. For example, Claire Ricks earned $100 a month teaching, whereas her sister, who took in boarders, earned $30 a month. This also correlates with the high respectability that they received and elevated their social status considerably. However, there was a low opportunity for economic and social advancement. You couldn't move up within the institution. Women wouldn't become principals, for example. So although they received slightly more freedom and opportunity than others, it was still mid-range. In conclusion, prostitutes and women in other industries experienced the same spectrum of freedom and opportunity. They were constrained by the inability to move up in San Francisco economic and social hierarchy, or within their specific fields, and they also experienced a high labor intensity across the board, as well as a low likelihood for accumulating wealth. Freedom and opportunity were limited for women in San Francisco Gold Rush, regardless of the career path they chose. So why does this matter? The history of sex workers has long been ignored and existed only in the peripheral of historical research. While we acknowledge that, yes, there were sex workers in the Gold Rush, there's not a lot of research done about them. There's also a certain stigma on sex work that muddles the possibility for true objective historical analysis. A lot of people have preconceptions about sex work and the morality of it, and in my reading, this seemed to muddle their objectivity in their research. And as well as the importance of historical revisionism, we're looking back now on historical events and ascertaining how it affected normal people as well as minority groups. So my research helps to incorporate the experiences of women in our understanding of the Gold Rush. These are my sources. These are the pictures I used. And thank you very much for listening. I will take your questions. Yes.
Hi. First, I'd like to say I am a prostitute. If I had to classify myself by one of your standards, I would be a parlor house girl without a madam. So I find it really refreshing that there's other women my age who are exploring the field of historical prostitution, which I do as well. And like you said, there's a huge stigma both about prostitutes in the current and day and age, which is why I'm so open about it, because you can't combat stigma without being open. And I just think that it's really, what you're doing is really, really important. I was totally surprised to hear, like, when you started, I was like, oh, she's gonna try to be like, prostitutes need saviors, we need to be saved. You know, we don't want to be saved. We need people to eradicate that stigma and speak the truth from our history. So
Thank you so much. No, thank you. That's really nice. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Yeah.
Did you find any research about like how the industry sort of, like how it progressed after the gold rush? Was there any sort of research?
Yeah. I kept my research mostly constrained up until 1877 because that's when my class is constrained. So, however, there was a boom in the prostitution industry, but in 1910 there was the Red Light Abatement Act in San Francisco, which basically stopped prostitution from being so open. Instead, it went underground. Before you could find a really prominent red light district, they called it the Barbary Coast, but after 1910 it kind of disappeared. Still kind of a seedy area, but it wasn't as obvious. Yeah.
I have a question. So you mentioned in the parlor houses that they had, I think, greater social mobility?
Yes.
Could you expand like what that looked like and why the parlor house women had it at, say, like the other women may not have?
Right. So in parlor houses, they were offered more respect. This is partially due to the fact that they were required to be extremely attractive and also witty and intelligent to maintain conversation with these men that they were entertaining in their houses. So they received more respect from the people around them in San Francisco, which correlates with a more social mobility because they could hang out with different kinds of people. More wealthy men, instead of being constrained to their social and economic class. Yeah.
In any of your research about the madams, did it say anything about them getting involved in political issues because they did have more?
Yes, this is actually a really fun part that I wanted to include, but I couldn't. They were actually super involved in politics because all of the politicians would pay off these madams, or like madams would pay off like the police, lawyers, judges to keep prostitution legal, or legal.
So do you think that maybe because more families came to San Francisco, the madams weren't able to keep up with
Yeah.
the demand of paying them off besides the people voting for them, and that's why it went underground?
That's part of the reason, but also it has to do with the understandings of like morality within this era. As more families moved out, more women. I read a lot of accounts by women. They would always talk about how like, oh, we need to go to San Francisco and save them. And like
Yeah.
save them from this immorality, terrible, awful.
So there's a big
badness.
movement to,
Yeah.
Yeah, historical context during that period really tends to shift, with many middle-class women do-gooders, right, getting
Yeah,
out there.
yeah,
So-
absolutely.
Did that correlate at all with the progressive movement in like the 1900s?
Yep.
I mean,
Absolutely. 100%.
all right.
And it was just a little outside the spectrum of the class
Sorry.
period time.
Yeah, I mean, I could go into it, but that would be breaking the rules.
So were all the madams that, the research that you did, all the madams were basically white, and
Yeah,
the
the only-
Chinese were,
That's correct. There was only one Chinese madam. I actually had a picture of her. I'll try to go back. But her name was Ah Toy, and she's the only one that I could find research on. I'm sorry. Okay. But yeah, most of them that I could find were white. There were also Latino and Black women that were involved in prostitution at this time. However, I couldn't find a lot of sources on them, so I didn't feel comfortable sharing that information just because I didn't know as much as I wanted to. But yeah, most of the madams were white, and the Latino and Black women at this time were in segregated areas, and they weren't involved in these ornate like prostitution houses. It was more like brothels or low-level institutions. But yeah, here's a picture of maybe Atoy. We're not sure. Yes.
And you did a great job, and a lot of other questions have already been answered about religion and world politics. As a historian, I'm always excited to learn about what was the most exciting aspect of source material and research in this project. So obviously a very exciting topic. You did a fantastic job with it. But what was the methodology? What was the exciting part of your research for this in terms of finding source material or not finding source material?
Okay, so I ran into an issue, and it's that I couldn't find any primary sources from prostitutes because it's not like they were like writing diaries about all the hookups they had. And it was difficult finding source material as well that was available to me at MiraCosta or at the Carlsbad Library where I hung out a lot. Just because like these books that historians have written on prostitution are really difficult to attain. So I did my best in getting as many books as possible on it. And I also read a lot of primary sources on other women, like women in the domestic service, in the accommodations industry mostly, and their experiences working. So that's where a lot of my understanding came from. Yeah, it was really fun. I had a good time. Yeah.
I have a library on historical prostitution. I have over 100
What?
books with primary and secondary sources if you ever want to.
That's so cool. I wish I knew about that before. You had a question too.
Did you happen to come across who was the top madam in San Francisco at that time?
Atoy was one of them, as well as Irene McCready, and Belle Cora. She's really cool too.
Was there a reason? Like, what was the reason?
Why was she so cool?
Or why she was the top?
Oh, why she was the top? They owned parlor houses, and